Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. When folks hear that you're a historian, there are a few questions that often spring to mind. Who's your favorite president? And what do you think caused the Civil War? Depending how you respond to those questions, people may have very strong feelings about it. The matter of causes of the Civil War in particular is still very much a part of our present-day conversation in this country. When we think about issues related to the Confederate flag, related to Confederate statues and other things like that, and the issue of states' rights, those matters are still very relevant in our national conversation today. So over this next series of lectures, we're going to be talking about the causes of the Civil War, which again feature very prominently in our national conversation, even now 150 plus years later. We're going to begin with a preliminary lecture talking about underlying causes and factors related to the growing sectionalism and the growing divide in the country, some of them going all the way back to our nation's founding. Now, in some ways, when we talk about causes of the Civil War, a scholar needs to ask right from the get-go, how far back do you want to go? You might recall in some of the very earliest lectures in this course when we talked about the colonial era and differences between the northern colonies and southern colonies, differences between New England and the Chesapeake and the Deep South. And we've talked a great deal in previous lectures about the importance of slavery, which was largely a southern institution, certainly in the era after the American Revolution, which we're going to be addressing a bit more in just a minute. So you could go back really throughout the entirety of what we have covered so far in this course, the early history of our nation, and look at two different very prominent themes of nationalism and sectionalism. So on the one hand, we have the United States, a union which is being strengthened by a whole series of national movements and developments. We've talked in previous lectures about things like the Great Awakening, the development of a national economy, the two-party system, manifest destiny, westward expansion, the waging of wars like the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War. So all of these things serve to enhance and strengthen a sense of nationalism, that we are all, even as independent states, we are all in this together in some way. At the same time, the other theme of sectionalism is also evolving. North and South developing their own institutions, their own cultures, distinct economies, and the closer we get to the Civil War, and really the lectures that we're going to be concentrating on over these next few, we see that it requires a very delicate balance to maintain that sense of union because the differences between North and South are growing so pronounced. So I want to talk in this preliminary lecture about some of the underlying factors. We might call them distant causes, but they're really factors that are evolving throughout the history of the country. And so in some ways, this preliminary lecture serves as review of a number of things we've already talked about. So if you recall, let's just start with the era of the Revolutionary War. And we talked about how the ideology and the language associated with the American Revolution, the idea pointedly of that all men are created equal, leads to differing views in North and South, specifically about the issue of slavery. And the northern states, after the Revolutionary War, move increasingly towards abolition, in some cases immediate abolition, in some cases delayed, but always moving toward abolition, while the South, as we have discussed, moves more towards defending the institution of slavery itself. There are other differences between North and South that we've talked about. When we think about the economies of the northern states versus southern, we talked about urbanization being more a feature of northern development than southern, manufacturing, factories, immigration, all of these kind of things playing more of a role in the North, while the South becomes predominantly an agricultural region, growing crops, and of course that leads southern states to be rooted in the institution of slavery, which we're going to be talking much more about. I also talked in a previous lecture about the idea of Southern honor and a culture of violence associated with that. And this will become a factor as we grow closer to the Civil War. Southerners increasingly feel like their honor is being slighted. And as we've discussed, the typical Southern response when your honor is slighted is to respond with violence. And so some scholars emphasize this as kind of a broad way of thinking about the Civil War itself. The South, as a cluster of states, as a whole culture, feels that it has been insulted, and the Southern response when you are insulted or slighted is to respond with violence. It's also not too much of a stretch to look at the Louisiana Purchase as one of the early but definitive causes of the Civil War, because ultimately it is the question of what is going to happen with that territory, and particularly the idea of the expansion of slavery into those territories, that will lead us directly to the Civil War. And we've already talked about one of the upshots of that debate, the Missouri Compromise. I notice now this should be 1820, not 1920, but the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And so recall that in 1819, Missouri was ready to enter the Union, clearly coming in as a slave state, but that would have upset the balance in the Senate. And so recall Henry Clay arranging one of his many compromises, the Missouri Compromise, bringing in Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. But it also established the Missouri Compromise line, extending out from the border of Missouri and really all the way across the nation. And so that line is going to become a major part of the debate going forward from there. The idea being that states entering north of that line would be free states and states south of that line would be slave states. But there will be a tremendous amount of debate going forward as we talk about other states entering the Union after the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So moving forward with that idea of the expansion of slavery and what was to become of slavery, let me talk a little bit more about that. Whether you believe that slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War or not, it was certainly among the leading causes of the Civil War. And so we need to talk again about the various positions on slavery in the decades leading up to the Civil War. And there were essentially five. One of them rooted in the Wilmot Proviso. Recall we talked about this in a previous lecture. The proposal that slavery would not be permitted into any of the new territories acquired after the war with Mexico. So places like Texas, California, and much of the Southwest, slavery would not be allowed. It passed in the House but was defeated in the Senate, so it was never adopted. But many Americans supported that view, that slavery should not be allowed to expand into the new territories. And there were a number of reasons for that. First of all, this was often called the free soil position. There was even a free soil party for a brief time that was rooted in this idea. There were a number of reasons one might be a free soiler. First and foremost, perhaps you despised the institution of slavery. So the kind of hard-boiled abolitionists would certainly support the idea that slavery should not expand. One also might be a free soiler because you didn't want to compete with slaves and slaveholders for jobs and prosperity. There were simply those who argued that this territory should be preserved for all free Americans and not having to compete with slaves and slaveholders. And there were others who supported this view as a way of maintaining the balance of power in Congress and perhaps even swinging the balance of power in Congress against the slaveholding South. There were many who were concerned if we allowed slavery to expand into those new territories that the slaveholders would have too much power in the country. Now recall that on the other extreme, the southern extreme, best argued by John C. Calhoun, was that slavery must be permitted everywhere. Slaves were property. Americans have the freedom to own property and bring it wherever they wished. And we're going to come back to Calhoun and this view as the debate intensifies. There were others who supported what we might call states' rights. It was also known as squatter sovereignty or popular sovereignty, the idea that the citizens in each state should determine the slave status or free status in that state. Another view was the idea that the Missouri Compromise line should simply be extended all the way to the Pacific. We've talked about that idea a few times already. That was an idea supported by James K. Polk and his Secretary of State, James Buchanan, who becomes important. He will soon, in these lectures, become President of the United States. So that was a relatively popular view. And then the fifth option, which was held by certainly a minority at that time, but a growing minority, was that slavery should simply be abolished completely and immediately. So these are some of the underlying factors and debates and discussions that will contribute to the increasing discord and the growing divide between North and South in the decade leading up to the Civil War. But we're not there yet. After the Mexican War and the acquisition of territories, which we talked about in previous lectures, we're still more than a decade away from the beginning of the outbreak of violence in the Civil War. So over the next lectures, we'll talk more about the immediate causes of the war and how this growing rift ultimately becomes the most violent and deadly war in our nation's history.